The cold air bites my lungs, sharp and clean, a contrast to the stale, charged atmosphere inside. My hand rests on the polished wood of the conference table, smooth under my fingertips. Across from me, he sits, oblivious, a slight smirk playing on his lips. He's talking, but the words blur, a low hum of self-importance. He thinks this is another negotiation he's already won. He thinks he holds all the cards, always has. His eyes, sharp and calculating usually, are softened by smugness. He's comfortable in this space he built, surrounded by the symbols of his power. The city skyline framed in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the hum of distant traffic a dull roar beneath the silent assertion of his dominance. He adjusts his cufflink, a casual, arrogant gesture. He believes he controls this room, this conversation me. The silence stretches, heavy and expectant, as he finishes his sentence, waiting for my response. He expects capitulation, maybe a tear, a plea. He expects the familiar tremble in my voice he's grown so accustomed to hearing over the past months. But my voice is steady when I speak. It is calm, clear, and resonates with a quiet finality that seems to surprise even the air around us. I watch the smirk falter, then vanish, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then disbelief. His posture stiffens. The confidence drains from his face, leaving behind something raw, something I've never seen directed at me, pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes widen, searching mine, trying to find the familiar reflection of the woman he broke. He doesn't find her. The world outside continues, unaware of the seismic shift occurring within these four walls. A siren wails in the distance, a fitting soundtrack to the collapse of his constructed reality. The silence in the room is deafening now, filled only by the rapid staccato of his breath and the slow, deliberate beat of my own heart. This is the moment, the culmination of fear, humiliation, and a quiet, burning rage. This is where his world ends, and mine begins again. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt this way, tell me in the comments. I read all of them. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before the chills settled into my bones, before the fear became a constant companion, life was a kind of gilded stasis. We lived in the kind of house that graced magazine covers, all clean lines, expensive art, and windows that looked out onto a manicured perfection I rarely touched. He built it, piece by piece, brick by expensive brick, and in doing so, he seemed to believe he had built me too, placed me carefully within its walls like another curated object. My role was simple, defined by the soft hum of privilege, the elegant wife, the gracious hostess, the woman whose needs were anticipated and met by an invisible army of staff, paid for by his endless stream of income. I wasn't naive. I knew where the money came from. Deals, mergers, acquisitions, the sterile, high-stakes world he inhabited downtown. He spoke of it sometimes, in abstract terms, using words like leverage, optimization, hostile takeover. I understood enough to be impressed, perhaps even a little intimidated. His success was undeniable, a force of nature that swept everything before it. And I was swept along, comfortably, my life smoothed out, buffered from the harsh edges of the real world. I had my causes, my charities, my social calendar. I had his name, which opened doors. I had the illusion of freedom, purchased with convenience. I signed documents when he asked, trusting completely. Our accounts were joint, our assets intertwined, or so I believed. Why wouldn't they be? We were married. We were a unit. He handled everything financial, always had. It was easier, he said. Less for me to worry about. And I, lulled by comfort and a misplaced sense of security, agreed. I had my own small inheritance, tucked away, separate, a small safety net from a previous life, but it felt unnecessary, almost quaint, compared to the flood of resources he commanded. I barely thought about it. There were moments, small ones, that looking back now, prickle like warnings ignored. The way he'd subtly question a purchase, not with anger, but a raised eyebrow, a quiet suggestion that perhaps something less expensive, less frivolous, would have been wiser. The way he always had the final say, even on things that felt like joint decisions. It wasn't overt control, not then. It was just direction. Guidance. I attributed it to his business mind, his innate sense of strategy and efficiency. He was building an empire. Of course, he thought strategically about everything, including our household. I didn't see the pattern, the slow tightening of the reins. I saw only the security, the stability, the life that others envied. I was financially illiterate by choice, by convenience, by trust. I floated in a golden bubble, tethered to him, believing the tether was made of love and partnership, not dependence. The air conditioning in his office was always set to Arctic. I remember shivering slightly, pulling my light cardigan tighter, even though it was a warm spring day outside. I had come downtown to meet him for lunch, a rare midweek treat. We'd had a minor disagreement that morning, nothing major, just about my plans for the afternoon. He hadn't liked that I was meeting a friend he didn't approve of. His disapproval often felt like a heavy blanket, stifling. But I'd pushed back, gently, and he'd waved it away eventually, saying we'd talk about it later. He didn't look up when I came in, just gestured to a chair with a flick of his wrist, his eyes still glued to the numbers dancing on his monitor. His assistant, perpetually calm and efficient, brought me a glass of water, then retreated silently. The silence in the vast office stretched, filled only by the click of his keyboard and the hum of the omnipresent AC. I waited, patient, used to his absorption in his work. Finally, he swiveled his chair to face me. His expression was unreadable, flat. No smile, no greeting. Just that cold, assessing look he reserved for business deals. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. My stomach tightened. This wasn't about lunch. This wasn't even about my friend. About what? I asked, trying to keep my voice light, normal. He leaned back, crossing his arms. The smirk was back, but this time, it wasn't smugness. It was cruel. "About your lifestyle," he said, the word heavy with disdain. "About your spending." I frowned. My spending hadn't changed. It was the same as it had always been. Controlled, within the unspoken boundaries he'd set. "What about it?" "It's excessive," he stated, as if stating a fact of nature. "Unnecessary, given the current situation." I blinked. What situation? He never discussed the specifics of his business, only the outcomes. Profits were up, weren't they? He'd just closed a major deal. What situation? I repeated, a thread of unease starting to weave itself into my calm exterior. He sighed, an impatient sound. "Business. Things are tightening, restructuring." For efficiency, he paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And that includes personal efficiency. We need to make changes." My heart began to pound. Changes? What kind of changes? What are you saying? His eyes narrowed, losing the last vestige of anything resembling affection. They were just cold, hard chips of ice. "I'm saying I'm cutting you off." The words hit me like a physical blow. Cutting me off? What did that even mean? He handled everything. There was no off button I could comprehend. "What? What do you mean, cutting me off?" "It's simple," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone designed to convey absolute authority. "The joint accounts are being closed. The cards are being canceled. As of today, you will no longer have access to my funds." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of it. Access to his funds? They were our funds. We were married. This was our life built together, even if he was the one who made the money. "But we're married," I stammered, the words feeling weak and inadequate. "This is our money, our life." He laughed then, a short, sharp, humorless sound that scraped across my nerves. "Your life I provided," he corrected, his voice laced with venom I hadn't heard before. "Your comfort I paid for. And your spending is out of control. Consider this a necessary adjustment. Until you learn to be more responsible." Responsible? I was responsible for managing a household, organizing events, representing him socially. I wasn't a spendthrift. I bought what was needed, what was expected of the wife of a man like him. Responsible? I don't understand. I don't spend excessively. You've always handled the budgets. Exactly, he cut in, his voice rising slightly. And I can no longer subsidize your hobbies. Your shopping. Your little projects. He gestured dismissively with his hand, as if swatting away an annoying fly. From now on, you will need to manage on a strict allowance. A very small one. Enough for necessities. And you will need to account for every cent. An allowance? Account for every cent? The humiliation was immediate and searing. I was not a child. I was his wife. Or was I? In that moment, looking at his face, I saw not a partner, but a warden, explaining the new rules of my gilded cage. An allowance? You're joking. I assure you, I am not, he said, his eyes hardening further. The cards are already being processed. The accounts linked to my business are being segregated. You will receive notification shortly. Your personal card, the one linked to the household account, will cease functioning by this evening. Panic flared, hot and suffocating. How would I buy groceries? Pay the staff. Put gas in the car. But the house? The staff? How will I manage anything? That, he said, leaning back again, the cruel smirk returning, full force, is for you to figure out. Perhaps you can manage without a driver. Perhaps the gardener only needs to come every other week. Perhaps you don't need fresh flowers constantly, he paused, letting the implications sink in. Necessities, as I said. You'll find a small amount transferred weekly to a new, separate account. It won't be much. You'll need to prioritize. He stood up, signifying the end of the conversation. He adjusted his tie, smoothing it down. He looked entirely composed, as if he had just discussed a quarterly report, not dismantled his wife's life. Think of it as a challenge, he said, a chillingly cheerful tone now entering his voice. A chance for you to understand the value of money, to appreciate what I provide. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my lungs starved for air. I just sat there, numb, watching him. He glanced at his watch. I have a call in 5 minutes. You should go. I'll have security escort you out. Security? To escort me out of his office? It was another layer of dehumanization, a stark reminder that in this space, I was no longer his wife, but a potential nuisance to be managed. I rose slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I just turned and walked towards the door, my mind reeling, trying to grasp the edges of this new, terrifying reality. The air outside didn't feel clean anymore. It felt thin, cold, and hostile. The golden bubble hadn't just popped. It had been systematically dismantled, leaving me exposed and adrift with nothing but the shards of my former life. The first few days were a blur of disbelief and mounting anxiety. I tried using my personal card at the grocery store. Declined. The sheer public humiliation of it, standing there while the cashier waited, the line behind me growing impatient. I mumbled something about a technical error and fled, leaving the full cart behind. I drove away, but the car's fuel gauge was low. I pulled into a gas station, tried the card again. Declined. I didn't have any cash. I had to leave the car there and walk home, a long, unfamiliar journey that took over an hour in shoes not meant for walking. By the time I got back to the house, my feet ached, and the sun had set. The staff, sensing the shift, were already murmuring. The housekeeper asked me about payment for a supplier. I had no answer. I had no way to pay her, or the driver, or the gardener. I felt a crushing wave of responsibility and helplessness wash over me. These people depended on me, on us, and I had been rendered utterly incapable of providing for them. I tried calling him. He didn't answer. I left messages, increasingly desperate, explaining the practicalities, the immediate needs. No response. He was just gone. Digitally absent, emotionally distant. He had built this intricate system of control, and now he had simply unplugged my access, leaving me floundering in the dark. The small amount he transferred arrived the next day. It was laughably, insultingly small. Barely enough to cover utilities for a week, let alone groceries, staff wages, gas, everything. It became clear very quickly that this wasn't just about controlling my spending. It was about making my life impossible. It was about forcing me into a state of total dependency, of begging, of acknowledging his absolute power over my very survival. The house felt enormous and empty. Every expensive object, every piece of art, every plush carpet seemed to mock me. I was a prisoner in a museum of my own former life, unable to even buy a loaf of bread to eat in its opulent kitchen. The isolation deepened quickly. Friends would call, invite me out for coffee or lunch. I had to make excuses. I couldn't explain the truth. My multimillionaire husband has cut me off financially, and I literally can't afford a cappuccino. The shame was too great. Besides, even if I could afford the coffee, I couldn't put gas in the car to get there. The car itself, a sleek, expensive SUV, felt like another cruel joke. It sat in the garage, a useless hunk of metal, without the key to its movement: money. I started rationing the food that was left in the pantry and fridge. Simple things: pasta, rice, canned goods. The fresh produce wilted and had to be thrown away because I couldn't afford more. The staff eventually stopped showing up. I couldn't blame them. I couldn't pay them. The house, once meticulously maintained, began to gather dust. Weeds started appearing in the perfect garden. The symbols of his success, left in my care, were slowly decaying, reflecting my own unraveling state. He called eventually, not to offer help, but to check in. His voice was sickeningly sweet, dripping with feigned concern. "How are you managing, dear?" he asked. I swallowed my pride, the bitter taste filling my mouth. "It's difficult," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I can't pay anyone. I can barely buy food. The car is out of gas." He chuckled, a low, satisfied sound. "Difficult?" "Yes, well, sometimes life is difficult when you're not accustomed to managing resources. Think of it as character building." Character building? This wasn't building character. This was systematic demolition. "This is cruel," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "You're leaving me with nothing." "Not nothing," he corrected, his tone hardening again. "You have the house. For now. And a generous allowance for necessities. Are you prioritizing? Are you making smart choices?" Smart choices? My smart choice would be to leave this gilded prison. But how? With no money, no car, no support network I could openly access without revealing the humiliating truth. "What do you want from me?" I asked, the question torn from my raw throat. "I want you to understand," he said. "To understand who provides. To understand your place. To be compliant. Appreciative." It wasn't just about money. It was about power. Absolute power. He wanted me broken, subservient, grateful for the crumbs he tossed my way. "I can't live like this," I said, finding a flicker of defiance. "Then perhaps you'll have to make different choices," he responded coolly. "Perhaps you'll realize that cooperating is far more comfortable than resisting. Think about it." He hung up before I could reply. I stood there, the dead phone in my hand, the silence of the house pressing in on me. He wasn't just withholding money. He was trying to starve me into submission. He thought he had me trapped, cornered, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. And for a long time, he was right. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of anxiety and dwindling resources. I ate simple, cheap meals. I walked everywhere I needed to go, which wasn't often. I learned to fix things myself around the house, small repairs that would have once been handled with a phone call. The isolation was the worst part. I felt invisible, erased. He called occasionally, always with the same patronizing tone. He'd ask if I'd learned my lesson yet. He'd mention something he knew I couldn't afford, like a charity gala or a trip, just to twist the knife. Each call was a reminder of his control, his smug certainty that I would eventually crack. And I almost did. There were nights I sat in the quiet house, the moonlight filtering through the windows, feeling utterly defeated. How could I fight this? He had all the power, all the resources, the entire system rigged in his favor. He was the master of this game, and I didn't even know the rules. One evening, rummaging through old boxes in the attic, looking for anything I might sell, another humiliating thought, I stumbled upon a box labeled Dad's Papers. It contained documents from my father, a corporate lawyer, who had passed away years ago. I hadn't looked at them since. Most of it was dry, legal jargon I didn't understand. But buried deep within, I found a file with my name on it. Inside were documents related to my inheritance, not just bank statements, but also some legal structures he had set up. There was a complex trust fund, established years ago, independent of me, managed by a firm he trusted. There was also documentation regarding some real estate, specifically a small commercial property downtown that had been transferred into my name years before we even met, structured in a way that made it notoriously difficult to touch or trace without the right legal keys. I had vaguely remembered something about a property. Maybe. He'd mentioned it once, Dad, saying it was a secure asset for my future. I had completely forgotten about it, absorbed into the ease of my life with my husband. As I read through the papers, struggling with the terminology, something shifted within me. It wasn't just about the existence of these assets. It was about the deliberate way my father had structured them. He had built walls around them, legal fortifications designed, it seemed, to protect me from something. Perhaps he had anticipated a need for independence I hadn't foreseen. Perhaps he had seen something in me, or the world, that I hadn't. The documents were complex, filled with clauses and conditions that seemed designed to frustrate anyone trying to access or claim the assets easily. It mentioned specific legal triggers, irrevocability, and named a seemingly obscure law firm as the trustee and administrator. A cold, hard spark ignited in my chest. It wasn't much compared to his empire, but it was mine. Truly mine, legally, undeniably, and protected. This wasn't the key to his downfall yet, but it was my key. A key to survival, yes, but more importantly, a key to independence. It was a point of leverage he didn't know about, a piece of the board he thought was empty. My father, in his quiet way, had given me a lifeline. But just having the asset wasn't enough. Accessing it was one thing. Using it to counter him, to fight back in his world of finance and law, felt impossible. I was still functionally broke, isolated, and ignorant of the very systems he used to control me. The property generated a modest rental income, but the papers showed it was tied up in the trust, not flowing directly to me. It would require navigating a complex legal structure I didn't understand, likely needing lawyers I couldn't afford. The trust itself seemed designed to release funds only under specific circumstances or through specific, complex procedures. The crisis deepened. He started hinting that he might need to sell the house. Not because he needed the money, I knew his business was still thriving, but because it was another way to assert control, to threaten my last refuge. He'd call and describe properties he was looking at, smaller, less grand houses, implying that's where I'd live if he was feeling generous enough not to simply leave me to fend for myself entirely. The house, the one place I still had some semblance of belonging, felt like it was being ripped from under my feet. He ramped up the psychological warfare. He'd send me pictures of bank statements with zeros in my name, or emails showing huge transfers being made, none of which were coming to me. He wanted me to see the money, to understand how close it was, and yet how utterly beyond my reach. He was enjoying it. I could hear it in his voice, see it in the rare times I saw him in person for brief, tense encounters, the gleam in his eyes, the tightening of his lips that wasn't a smile, but a predatory satisfaction. I was losing weight. I wasn't sleeping well. The stress was a physical weight on my chest. I felt trapped, a mouse in a maze designed by a cruel, intelligent cat. He had anticipated everything, it seemed, every potential avenue of escape. My friends were sympathetic, but they couldn't help financially in the way I needed, and I still couldn't fully articulate the depth of the control he wielded without sounding dramatic or even delusional. Some suggested I just leave, get a lawyer. But lawyers cost money. And leaving meant walking away with nothing but the clothes on my back, because he'd made sure I had no accessible funds to secure even a temporary apartment or start over. He seemed to be waiting for me to break, to call him, sobbing, begging for mercy, for a return to the golden cage, even on his harsh terms. He wanted me to surrender completely. But the fire that the papers from my father had ignited hadn't gone out. It had smoldered, banked by despair and fear, but it was still there. It was a tiny ember of defiance in the vast, cold darkness he had plunged me into. The knowledge that I had anything outside his control began to feel less like a potential escape route and more like a weapon. I spent hours poring over my father's documents, cross-referencing terms online, trying to piece together the legal puzzle. It was slow, painstaking work, like trying to decipher a foreign language. But slowly, painstakingly, I started to understand. The trust was incredibly complex, designed to protect the assets from creditors, from lawsuits, and yes, it seemed, from controlling spouses. The property was held in a specific type of structure that made it very difficult to include in marital asset division, depending on how it was handled. And the key, the crucial piece, was the obscure law firm named as the trustee. I researched the firm. It was small, old-fashioned, specializing in complex trusts and estate planning for wealthy families looking for absolute security and privacy. They weren't the flashy, high-profile lawyers my husband used. They operated quietly, meticulously, outside the public eye. A risky idea began to form. An audacious, terrifying idea. I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight him head-on. Not in the way he fought, with armies of high-priced litigators. But what if I didn't need to fight him? What if I could use the structures my father built, the structures he didn't know existed or didn't understand, to protect myself and simultaneously dismantle his game? It wasn't just about the property or the trust income. My father's papers included detailed notes, handwritten in his precise script, explaining why he had structured things this way. They were filled with dry, legal observations about asset protection, but also hints of a deeper understanding of human nature, specifically the potential for manipulation and control when wealth was involved. One note, scribbled in the margin next to a diagram of the trust, read, "Leverage is not always financial. Sometimes, it is simply knowing where the blind spots are." Blind spots. My husband had a financial empire, but perhaps he had blind spots in the quiet, old-world legal structures my father had favored. He was a master of aggressive takeovers, of leveraging debt and market volatility. But was he as adept at navigating the intricate, sometimes arcane rules of ancient trusts and asset protection laws designed not for growth, but for absolute, unassailable security? The thought was a spark. Could I use my father's creations, designed for my protection, to fight back? Not just to survive, but to actually hit him where he was weakest, where he was complacent. His weakness wasn't a lack of money. It was his absolute confidence in his control, his belief that he had anticipated every move, that I was utterly helpless. The documents also revealed something else, buried in the technical details of some historical transfers related to the commercial property. An old agreement, signed years ago, detailing a reciprocal arrangement between the property's ownership and something else. Something linked tangentially to my husband's early business ventures. It was obscure, likely forgotten, tied to regulations from decades past that were now largely obsolete, but hadn't been formally dissolved for some administrative reason. It seemed to grant the owner of my commercial property certain rights related to specific long-term leases held by one of his foundational shell corporations. Rights that, in theory, could cause immense administrative headaches and potentially trigger penalties if not handled according to the defunct but still legally binding terms of the old agreement. It was a legal ghost, lurking in the background, a piece of forgotten bureaucracy. The full implications didn't dawn on me at first. It seemed too technical, too insignificant. But the more I read, the more I realized that this old agreement, if activated or brought to light, could create a nightmare of red tape, audits, and potential legal challenges for that specific shell corporation. And that shell corporation, I vaguely recalled from dinner conversations years ago, was the historical entity through which much of his current, far larger empire had been leveraged and built. Messing with its foundations, even through bureaucratic means, could have unforeseen, cascading effects on his current financial structures, particularly those dependent on credit and regulatory compliance. It was a long shot. It was crazy. It would mean delving into the incredibly complex, deliberately opaque world of corporate finance and legal structures that he dominated. But the alternative was waiting for him to decide my fate, to wither away in this empty house, dependent on his cruel whims. The turning point wasn't a sudden flash of inspiration, but a slow, grinding accumulation of indignities and fear, tempered by the quiet strength I found in my father's foresight. It was the realization that I had nothing left to lose, coupled with the knowledge that I had a hidden card to play. I decided I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't plead. I would fight, using the only tools I had: stealth, patience, and the forgotten legacy my father had left me. The trust, the property, the obscure legal agreement. These weren't just assets. They were potential weapons, waiting to be aimed. I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed help navigating the legal labyrinth, someone who understood archaic trusts and corporate law, someone discreet and not beholden to my husband's influence. The small, old-fashioned law firm, the trustee of my father's trust, seemed like the only option. I had no money to pay for their time up front, but my father's papers included a clause stating the trust was empowered to disburse funds for the protection or benefit of the beneficiary under specific circumstances, including legal representation deemed necessary by the trustee. It was a long shot, but it was my only shot. I spent days crafting a formal request to the trustee firm, outlining my situation, referencing the relevant clauses in the trust documents, and explaining why I needed their legal assistance immediately under the terms of the trust. I sent it certified mail, a thick envelope filled with copies of the relevant papers. Then I waited. The waiting was agony. Every declined card, every empty pantry shelf, every moment of isolation was a fresh wave of doubt. Had I read the documents correctly? Was I insane to think I could use these obscure legal structures against him? A week later, a letter arrived, heavy and official-looking. It was from the trustee firm. My hands trembled as I opened it. They had reviewed my request. They had reviewed the trust documents. They acknowledged their fiduciary duty. They agreed to a preliminary meeting. Not a promise of help, but a possibility. A crack of light in the darkness. I managed to arrange a ride to their office, using the last few dollars I had squirreled away from small cash gifts over the years. The office was in an old, quiet building downtown, a stark contrast to my husband's glittering tower. It smelled of old paper and wood polish. The lawyers were older, quiet, their suits conservative. They listened patiently as I spoke, explaining the situation, presenting my father's papers, describing my husband's actions. They asked precise, clinical questions, their faces unreadable. When I finished, the senior partner, a man with sharp eyes and a gentle voice, spoke. "Your father was a very prudent man," he said. He anticipated many eventualities. He looked at the documents regarding the commercial property and the old agreement. "This is interesting. Quite complex. Few firms deal with structures like this anymore." He didn't promise victory. He didn't even promise a smooth path. But he confirmed that, yes, under the terms of the trust, they could represent me. The trust would cover their fees for this matter. A wave of relief, so profound it made my knees weak, washed over me. I wasn't alone. I had legal representation, funded in a way my husband could not easily cut off. The strategy they outlined was not about fighting him in the divorce courts over assets he had already hidden or controlled. It was about using the specific, hidden legal mechanisms I possessed to create maximum disruption and leverage in his world. The world of business credit, corporate compliance, and financial stability built on intricate, sometimes fragile, structures. The key was the old agreement tied to my commercial property and his shell corporation. It contained clauses that, if triggered, could mandate extensive audits, force the renegotiation of key long-term leases critical to the cash flow of that historical entity, and potentially expose it to significant regulatory fines if found non-compliant with the terms of the old, forgotten law it referenced. Activating these clauses would be like pulling a thread on a sweater. It might seem small, but it could unravel everything if pulled hard enough. Especially if his current, larger corporate structure relied on the clean financial history and compliance status of that underlying entity for credit ratings, loan covenants, or investor confidence. They advised me to keep quiet, to not let him know I had sought legal help, let alone from this firm or with this strategy. He was expecting me to hire a typical divorce lawyer, someone who would argue over alimony and asset division based on current, visible wealth. He was not expecting me to attack the hidden, foundational structures of his empire using forgotten legal instruments. The process was slow, deliberate, and required absolute secrecy. The lawyers began their work, quietly filing notices, sending formal inquiries regarding the old agreement and the commercial property's rights to the registered address of his shell corporation. They did it in a way that was legally proper, but designed to bypass his usual gatekeepers and land directly on the desks of his compliance officers or internal legal team, creating confusion and alarm within his organization before he was even personally aware of it. While they worked, I maintained my facade. I continued to live quietly in the big house, still struggling financially, still appearing isolated and vulnerable. When he called, I was subdued, vague about my difficulties, careful not to betray any knowledge or newfound strength. He interpreted my quietness as resignation, my lack of visible activity as defeat. His calls became less frequent, his tone more dismissive. He seemed bored with my lack of fight, confident he had won. He started talking about dating, about his future plans that clearly did not include me, except perhaps as a minor problem to be tidied away eventually. He was so sure of my powerlessness that he dropped his guard, becoming careless. One day, weeks after the process had started, he called, bubbling with irritating confidence. He was closing a huge deal, he said, leveraging significant capital. He spoke about credit lines, investor confidence, regulatory approvals, the intricate dance of high finance that was his playground. He mentioned, in passing, a small, unexpected delay related to an archaic compliance issue with an older entity, but dismissed it as a minor bureaucratic hurdle that his team was handling. An archaic compliance issue with an older entity. My blood ran cold, not with fear, but with a sudden, exhilarating jolt of pure, cold satisfaction. The thread had been pulled. It was working. My lawyers confirmed it. Their inquiries regarding the old agreement and the commercial property's rights had reached the right people within his organization. The complexity and obscurity of the issue meant it wasn't a simple matter to dismiss. It required research into forgotten laws, analysis of decades-old agreements, and verification of current compliance status for an entity he likely hadn't thought about in years, but which was critical to his present-day financial architecture. The inquiry itself, completely legitimate and stemming from my legal ownership of the commercial property, was creating disruption, demanding resources, and potentially raising red flags internally. It was like launching a torpedo below the waterline of his seemingly unsinkable ship. From the outside, everything looked fine. But underneath, structural integrity was being questioned, leaks were starting to appear. The next phase of the plan was crucial. My lawyers, acting on my behalf as the owner of the commercial property, initiated formal dispute proceedings related to the terms of the old agreement and the specific long-term leases held by his shell corporation. This wasn't a lawsuit for money. It was a legal challenge based on the specific, obscure rights detailed in the old agreement, alleging non-compliance with its terms and seeking specific performance or remedy as outlined in the document. It was designed not to win a settlement, but to force his hand, to create a crisis that he couldn't ignore or easily squash with his usual tactics. This triggered deeper reviews within his company, involving outside auditors and legal experts. The more they dug into the old agreement and its implications for the shell corporation, the more complex and potentially problematic it became. It threatened to expose inconsistencies, administrative oversights, or even potential past noncompliance that could jeopardize his current financial standing, particularly with the banks and investors who had extended massive credit lines based on the presumed rock-solid foundation of his entire corporate structure. The pressure on him began to mount, though I didn't see it directly. His calls to me stopped entirely. His assistant became curt and evasive when I called, asking if I could reach him. The house grew quieter, but the silence felt different now, less like abandonment, more like a tense pause before a storm. The climax didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in his office, in the same sterile room where he had delivered his decree of financial execution months earlier. My lawyers had informed his legal team that I was prepared to escalate the dispute proceedings significantly, potentially seeking injunctive relief that could directly impact the operations tied to the Shell Corporation and, by extension, create chaos in his current deals. They also hinted, without revealing everything, that there were other complexities they were uncovering related to the historical structuring of assets and responsibilities stemming from that old agreement. It was enough to rattle him, to make him realize this wasn't just a minor bureaucratic hiccup. This was a targeted, sophisticated attack originating from a source he had dismissed as powerless. He called me, his voice tight with controlled fury. He demanded I come to his office immediately. He didn't ask, he ordered. And this time, I went, not out of obligation or fear, but because I was ready. I walked into the office, the same biting AC, the same view of the city. He was standing by the window, his back to me, his shoulders tense. He turned slowly as I entered. The smugness was gone, replaced by a dangerous, simmering rage. He looked like a cornered animal. "What the hell is this?" he bit out, his voice low and menacing. In his hand, he held a document, a formal notice from my lawyers regarding the dispute proceedings. I sat down calmly, taking the seat across from the conference table. I didn't speak. I just looked at him, my expression neutral, maybe with just a hint of the dry humor I'd rediscovered. He slammed the paper down on the table. This archaic nonsense. This is interfering with my business. My deals. Is it? I asked, my voice quiet, conversational. It was the first time I had spoken to him without a tremor of fear or a hint of desperation since he cut me off. He stepped towards the table, his hands balled into fists. "You think this is clever? Using some dusty old agreement to cause problems? You think you can shake me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Oh, I think I do," I said, meeting his glare steadily. "I've had a lot of time to think, to learn, to read." I gestured slightly to the paper on the table. My father was a very thorough man. He understood things you seem to have overlooked. His eyes narrowed. "Your father's irrelevant. This is about you. You think you can extort me?" "Extort?" I smiled then, a small, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "No. I'm simply exercising my legal rights as the owner of a certain commercial property. Rights that were established long before I even knew you. Rights that seem to be causing you inconvenience." "Inconvenience? This is a liability," he roared, his control slipping. "This affects my credit lines. My investors. It's exposing things. Perhaps you should have considered that," I said, my voice still quiet, but now with an edge of steel. "When you decided to leave me with nothing. When you decided to make me dependent. When you decided I was irrelevant." He stared at me, his chest heaving. He couldn't comprehend it. The woman he had systematically stripped bare, who couldn't even buy a gallon of milk, was now sitting across from him, calmly holding a legal lever that threatened to destabilize the very foundations of his empire. You had this planned?" he stammered, disbelief warring with fury on his face. "Not planned," I corrected. "Discovered. Your cruelty forced me to look. And when I looked, I found that my father, in his quiet way, had prepared me for exactly this. He built protection. Protection you bulldozed over, without even knowing it was there." "Protection? What protection? You have nothing." "I made sure of that." He was shouting now, his face red. "Did you?" I leaned forward slightly. "Because it seems my father built something you couldn't touch. A trust designed to be impenetrable. A property with rights attached to an agreement so old, you forgot it existed. Rights that, funnily enough, give me significant leverage over the historical entity underpinning your current financial structures." His jaw dropped. He hadn't known about the trust, not really. He'd seen my inheritance as a small, manageable sum that would eventually be absorbed into our joint assets. He certainly hadn't understood the legal structures around it or the commercial property. He had been so focused on controlling the money he made, the empire he built, that he'd been blind to the quiet, legally fortified assets I held independently. And he had completely missed the implications of that ancient agreement tied to the property. You froze my business credit, he accused, though it was more a realization than a question. The cascade of problems originating from the dispute, the audits, the legal uncertainty surrounding the Shell Corporation had spooked the credit agencies and some of his lenders. They were reviewing their positions, holding back new credit, demanding assurances he couldn't easily give, while the legal ghost of the old agreement haunted his books. My lawyers simply filed inquiries, I said, maintaining my calm. The dispute proceedings are legitimate, based on the terms of an agreement your company is a party to. If that causes financial institutions to reevaluate their risk, that's a consequence of your own complex structures, wouldn't you say? This is blackmail, he yelled, spittle flying from his mouth. No, I said softly. Blackmail is threatening someone with ruin unless they comply. I am not threatening you. I am merely pursuing my legal rights. Rights I can afford to pursue, thanks to a trust fund you didn't know couldn't be touched. The plot twist wasn't just that I had assets he didn't know about. It was that those assets, combined with my father's intricate legal foresight and that forgotten, archaic agreement, gave me a specific, potent weapon uniquely capable of disrupting his specific financial vulnerabilities, his reliance on pristine credit, regulatory compliance, and the unquestioning faith of his investors and lenders. He hadn't just cut me off. He had unleashed a force he didn't know existed, one that was now feeding on the very foundations of his power. He staggered back, clutching his chest. His face was pale, his eyes wide with genuine terror. This wasn't about money anymore for him. It was about the collapse of his carefully constructed reality, the potential public humiliation, the unraveling of everything he was. You can't do this, he whispered, the bluster gone, replaced by a desperate plea. I already have, I said, my voice unwavering. Your business credit is under review because of the uncertainty this dispute has created. Your deals are on hold. Your investors are asking questions. All because you didn't think a woman you cut off could fight back, let alone understand the details of an agreement signed 50 years ago. He let out a guttural scream, a sound of pure, raw agony and defeat. It wasn't the scream of physical pain, but the sound of a man watching his empire crumble because he underestimated the quiet woman he thought he owned. He lunged towards me, his hand outstretched as if to strike, but stopped short, his face contorted in a silent snarl of impotent rage. Security, alerted by the noise, appeared instantly at the door. She's insane, he shrieked at them. She's trying to ruin me. I calmly gathered my bag. I'm leaving, I told the security guards, my voice steady. My lawyers will be in touch. Perhaps now you'll be more willing to negotiate the terms of our separation in a way that is equitable. Perhaps you'll even realize that the assets you thought were yours might not be so secure after all, if you don't address the very legitimate issues raised by my legal team. I stood up and walked towards the door, leaving him standing there, screaming, surrounded by the symbols of his power which suddenly seemed fragile, hollow. I didn't look back. I walked out of his office, out of his building, and into the city air. It felt different this time. It wasn't just clean, it felt like freedom. Hard-won, terrifying, but utterly, undeniably mine. The screaming echoed in my mind for days. It was a haunting sound, the sound of a man's world imploding. The aftermath wasn't a simple walk into the sunset. It was messy, complicated, and filled with legal maneuvering. He didn't give up easily. He hired more lawyers, tried to counter the dispute, to dismiss the old agreement as irrelevant. But my lawyers were prepared. They systematically dismantled his arguments, referencing obscure case law and presenting irrefutable documentation from my father's files. The trust was indeed unassailable. The commercial property and its attached rights were legally mine and protected. The old agreement was valid and enforceable. The pressure on his business continued to mount. Deals fell through. Credit lines were frozen or reduced. Investors pulled back, spooked by the uncertainty and the potential legal entanglements stemming from the core entity of his structure. He was bleeding money, not because of the dispute itself, but because the dispute had exposed vulnerabilities and created a regulatory and financial quagmire that paralyzed his operations. He finally agreed to negotiate, not from a position of strength, but from desperation. He wanted the dispute to go away. He needed the cloud over his shell corporation lifted. My lawyers negotiated ruthlessly. They didn't ask for alimony or a settlement based on a percentage of his current wealth. They demanded the transfer of specific assets. The house, yes, but also several other properties he owned outright, liquid assets held in accounts not directly tied to his operational credit issues, and a significant lump sum cash payment in exchange for settling the dispute related to the commercial property and the old agreement. He resisted, threatened, blustered. But every day the dispute lingered, the pressure on his business intensified. His screaming fit in the office had been the first crack. The freezing credit and failing deals were the widening chasm. He had built his empire on speed, leverage, and exploiting perceived weaknesses. He had no defense against a slow, quiet, legally complex attack on his hidden foundations, especially when it originated from someone he had rendered financially helpless. In the end, he conceded. He signed the agreements, transferring assets that far exceeded what any divorce court would likely have awarded me, certainly based on the financial picture he would have presented. He did it to stop the bleeding, to remove the unpredictable, damaging force that I had become. He traded significant visible wealth and property to protect the core of his empire, the parts that relied on his spotless financial reputation and access to capital. I walked away with the house, several other properties, and a substantial amount of liquid cash. More than enough to live comfortably, to invest, to build a new life entirely on my own terms. The commercial property and the trust fund remained separate, a secure base I could use or not, a quiet monument to my father's foresight. There wasn't a triumphant feeling of pure victory, more a profound sense of exhaustion, relief, and a strange, cold satisfaction. I had survived. I had fought back, not by playing his game, but by finding a different game entirely, one he didn't even know was being played until it was too late. His screaming was the sound of him realizing he had created the weapon that brought him to his knees, by underestimating me completely. The house feels different now. It's still large, still beautiful, but it's mine. Truly mine. The dust is gone. The garden is tended. I can buy groceries without anxiety. I can drive my car without worrying about gas. These simple things, taken for granted for so long, now feel like profound luxuries. I learned a lot about money, about power, about control. But mostly I learned about resilience, about finding strength in unexpected places, about the fact that sometimes the quietest people, the ones dismissed as irrelevant, can possess the sharpest insights and the most potent, hidden forms of power. He lost more than money or assets. He lost his absolute certainty, his control, his belief in his own invincibility. And I, in losing everything he provided, found everything I needed to stand on my own. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.